So you ever have a job you're completely unqualified for? At first, the novelty and the challenge is kind of exhilarating, right? But very quickly, that exhilaration tends to turn into, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? And that was basically how I entered the field of mental health. So that was about 6 years ago, and at the time I was working as a professional nature photographer. But more importantly, my wife had just sat me down and announced that we were expecting our first child. And in the same breath basically said, honey, it's time to get a real job. And so I opened up the classifieds and somehow got hired as a teacher at a mental health organization called Northwest Passage. Now, I knew going into this that Northwest Passage was a residential treatment center for teens experiencing really severe emotional and behavioral disruptions. But it wasn't until I got in the classroom and actually started learning their stories that I understood what that meant. These were some of the most struggling young men and women anywhere. From severe depression to emerging bipolar disorder to issues with addiction, these young men and women had come to Northwest Passage from all around the country because their issues were so significant and complex that there often just weren't other organizations that could meet their needs. So many had backgrounds in things like trauma, neglect, poverty, things beyond what most of you can even begin to imagine, though I'm sure some of you can. Many had histories of suicide attempts or a life on the run. We're very fortunate that a couple of these young men and women have given me permission to share their stories with you tonight. One of them is a young woman named Molly. Molly came to Northwest Passage experiencing really severe depression that had spiraled into eating disorders that had gotten out of control. And the depression continued to spiral into drug abuse and then eventually an attempt at taking her own life shortly before coming to our organization. Or like Jaden here, who at the age of 15 had really significant issues with drug addiction and, as so often goes with it, with depression. And before coming to Northwest Passage, he had overdosed twice within a week and was close to death. And so essentially, every single kid who came to Northwest Passage was like Jaden or Molly, just on the brink, their lives filled with despair, slipping away. And it was in a classroom with these young people feeling the weight of their pain, struggling to engage them in the task of learning when they were just in a struggle for survival, that I began to feel in way over my head. I got to that point of, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? I was slipping away myself. But something inside me propelled me to hang on just a little while longer. It was probably fear of my pregnant wife. And so, in an act of job survival, I turned to the thing that I knew best, and that was nature photography. I was very fortunate to get a little grant from the National Park Foundation that allowed me to purchase a handful of cameras, a few computers for the classroom, and I started getting my kids out along the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway on just sort of a fairly informal basis to take some photos, a sort of a little adjunct to classroom activities. But very quickly, something surprising started to happen. My students started taking these astonishingly beautiful photos, way more beautiful than the little snapshots that I was expecting. And so, sensing some potential, I kind of went all in. I developed a little curriculum, a simple but very powerful curriculum that distilled all my photography knowledge to a very simple form. And I set out with the single-minded purpose of trying to show my kids how to become really awesome nature photographers, like true artists. And people thought I was crazy, but my kids kept getting better and better photos. It was photos like this by a young man named Derek who came in with fairly similar issues to what Jaden had, just really significant issues with addiction and depression. And I could not, for the life of me, get Derek to engage in any sort of formal classroom activities. But you put a camera in his hand, put him by a river, and his eye and his photographic technique was just flawless. And he was one of the first students that made me realize that I was going to have students with a lot more natural aptitude for this stuff than I did. And then something else started to happen. these students began using their photographs as windows through which they could understand their lives and their struggles and their hopes and their despair. And they began writing the most astonishing reflections and poems to accompany their photos. A young man named Chuck took this photo, and along with it, he writes, "I'm just a teenager trying to make it, a teenager trying to get there, a teenager trying to move on, a teenager trying to break free. I'm just a teenager that doesn't want to fall through the cracks." We had another young man named Dakota who came in, and Dakota's therapist just could not get Dakota to talk about his relationship with his mother. He just wouldn't talk about it. And one day, Dakota takes this picture of just a little splash in the water, and I see he has this photo pulled up on his screen, and he's writing something in his notebook. And I say, "What are you writing, Dakota?" And this is what he had written. He wrote, "Everybody cries. They cry for the sake of things like hate or stupidity. My mom cries because of me. I guess that's because of her pure love for me. This picture reminds me of all the tears my mom has shed over me, tears of joy, hurt, and sorrow." Afterwards, the therapist asked me, "Ben, how'd you get Dakota to talk about his mother?" I'm like, "He just wrote something with his photo. I don't know." And so through their photography, the best way I can describe it is that I began to see my students come alive, to reconnect, to re-engage with life, and to unleash this vast potential, this potential that had been sitting there all along, right under the surface, but it was kept at bay by the trauma and the pain. But with a camera in their hands, this potential and their humanity began just pouring out of them. I got to see the best sides of them. And it was just so beautiful. And so I began to design these experiences to push the kids even further, to give their skills and their potential a richer and richer playground to thrive in. And so we went to national parks all around the country, like Badlands and Yellowstone National Park. And these are all backcountry wilderness expeditions. Apostle Island's in our own backyard, Isle Royale National Park, Rocky Mountain National Park. We even just recently returned from an expedition to Costa Rica. And we're now taking them underwater where they're giving us a glimpse of freshwater ecosystems that few have ever seen. And with every challenge and every new opportunity, these kids rise to that challenge, not in spite of the challenge, but because of the challenge. They're just ready for it. They're just waiting for something to sink their teeth into. And now, 5 years into this, their work has been seen by millions at exhibitions all around the United States, on TV, and even at big league baseball games up on the big screen. And for most of these kids, this is a new kind of recognition. We had a reception once for an opening of their art, and the kids had received a standing ovation. And afterwards, one of the kids, Cody, he comes up to me and says, "Ben, that was the first time I'd ever been recognized for something good." And it's so true. I realized, absolutely, these kids have spent their lives on the margins, in the shadows, stigmatized, kept at arm's length. And so this embrace by the world, by society, is transformational in its own right. But along with the transformation the kids were experiencing, I was experiencing a transformation in my understanding of who these kids were and what it means to struggle with a really significant mental health issue. So these are kids whose lives have been defined by their pain, and they've been through many, many well-intentioned systems that seek to understand their pain, to put a label on their pain, and to fix their pain, right? We fix what's broken, just like a broken bone. If you have a broken arm, you get an x-ray, you set the bone, you put a cast on it, you fix what's broken. That's what mental health treatment is all about, right? I don't think so. And so often that approach just doesn't yield results. Because when I brought my students into the woods with cameras in their hands, I was not seeing broken bones. I was seeing strength and potential and creativity far greater than my own, and grit and greatness. And I was seeing heroes. And these are heroes that were right in front of us all along. But we just weren't seeing them, even though they were staring us in the face because we were so focused on fixing what was broken. And so I came to realize that the truth of who we are is not that we are either sick or we're well. We're not either broken human beings or beautiful human beings. We're broken human beings and beautiful human beings. And so, how to achieve well-being and to bring out that what's best in us, we can't just focus on what's broken. And yes, we have to recognize it. It's still there. We have to give it the respect and the attention it deserves. But along with that, we have to put just as systematic and as deliberate of our attention on bringing out the strength and the beauty that's inside of each of us. And you'd think, well, of course we should do that. Shouldn't we? That's like so logical, so intuitive. But so often that's not what happens. Just think for a moment about all the textbooks and all the manuals out there that are about diagnosing and treating the diseases and the disorders of mental health. Just imagine a world if we had just as many textbooks and manuals out there about understanding and drawing out the beauty that is inherent to every human life. And so, what does that mean? How do you draw out the beauty that is inherent to every human life? It comes down to connecting to three things in particular. First, you need to connect to a guide, some sort of a mentor or a counselor or a therapist or a teacher, somebody who sees the best in you no matter what, who has an unwavering optimism in your potential. Because so often we're just not good at recognizing the potential that's inside of ourselves. But when someone sees the best in us, then we see the best in ourselves. Second, we need an environment that not only feels safe and secure, but that also ignites our creativity and our passion and our curiosity and our sense of wonder and our sense of connection to the world around us. I think nature is one of the most effective and potent stages upon which to have that kind of experience, and that's why this programming has worked so well. But it can certainly be things other than nature. And third, you need a vehicle, a tool, something to translate that inner beauty that's inside of you into a way that has meaning and resonance in the world outside. And I think that's why art is such a particularly effective way to achieve that, photography in particular. But it doesn't have to just be art. And when my students had those three things, when they connected to a guide, an environment, and a vehicle that allowed them to reveal their strength through their photos, what happened was the pain sort of started to fade into the background a little bit. It was still there. We still acknowledge it. But the pain wasn't as intense. And the darkness wasn't as suffocating when it was sharing recognition with the light. And I think every photographer, that ties into something every photographer already knows, is that so often the most beautiful photos are the ones where the light is shining through the storm clouds, right? Where the darkness and the light, they're still there, but the beauty of the scene as a whole is what we see. That scene is defined by its beauty. So in case you were curious, Molly is now enrolled in college. She's apprenticing with a professional photographer in her hometown, and she's recently started her own photography business. Jaden has been clean from drugs for almost a year and now travels around the region speaking to thousands of students about addiction and depression. Thank you.